Good morning, brothers and sisters. My warmest welcome to our podcast, Creativity and Crisis. My name is Dr. Glenn T. Martin. For a number of years, I've been president of the World Constitution and Parliament Association, an organization working to address our planetary crises and to establish an enduring and liberating human future. I'm also a philosopher by profession who loves thinking and creative vision and inspiring ideas. My newest book is called Design for a Living Planet, the Earth Constitution Solution. In these podcasts, I engage in dialogue with prominent thinkers, scholars, and activists who are similarly concerned about the multitude of crises confronting humanity. Are there creative and practical solutions, and how can these solutions be achieved? I hope our listeners will both stay with us and join us in the thought processes that have become an utterly necessary part of our quest to create a decent planetary civilization for everyone. Let me introduce my speaker today, who's a psychologist, an activist, and a manager of large organizations. His name is Bob Flax, Ph.D. He's dedicated to addressing human suffering at the individual, organizational, and global levels. He began his career as a psychotherapist in the 1970s and has worked in a variety of settings, hospitals, prisons, private practice, and he's managed a 3,000-person volunteer division in San Quentin's death row in California. He's taught psychology at LaGuardia Community College, Sierra University, and several other universities. From his prison experience and international travel, Bob was struck by the large systems that contribute to human suffering. As a result, he pursued additional training in organizational development and conflict resolution, expanding his focus to include organizational and large systems change. His work with large systems led to the World Federalist movement, where he has served as past president of the Democratic World Federalists, counselor to the World Federalist Movement Institute for Global Policy, and a board member of Citizens for Global Solutions. He also teaches a course in global governance and Democratic World Federation at Saybrook University and has served as their co-director for research. He has undergraduate degrees in psychology and philosophy from New York University and a Ph.D. from Saybrook University and an M.A. in organizational development from Simona State University, a certificate in global affairs from New York University, and a diploma in global leadership at the UN University for Peace in Costa Rica. Welcome to Crisis and Creativity, Bob. Thank you for being here. We live in a world in which a lot of people are talking about crisis, right? A lot of people think that the world is in a terrible condition in one way or another and is serious enough to be called a crisis. What is your thinking about that theme?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I agree. I mean, I think we have multiple crises, and I guess the way one would explain that depends on where you get your news from. So so there are crises that many of us hear about virtually every day. I mean, things like the pandemic, climate change, race-based issues, political divisions in our country. And some of those crises are more on the national scale and some are more global.
Right.
And then there are others that you hear about less often, perhaps I would think weekly, things like global hunger, the widening wealth gap in society, mass migration, various human rights abuses. And then there's, I would say, a third class of crises that are largely invisible, that very rarely make the news. Things like, topsoil depletion around the world, the lack of access to clean drinking water,
Right.
things of that sort. Certainly, there are other parts of the world that live with them constantly, but they're not things that we necessarily hear about.
Yeah.
So I would say for sure there are multiple crises, and they're all around us essentially.
Yeah. Well, how about the last couple of things you mentioned, the shrinking of the viable topsoil in the world and the shrinking of fresh water supplies, they're often associated with climate, the climate
Yes.
crisis. And and there's perhaps a whole list of things that could be included under the climate crisis, like pollution,
Hmm.
plastic waste, and so on. W- would you say that the other kinds of crisis that you were just talking about are related? Are all these different dimensions of crises related in your
Yeah.
thinking?
Yeah. Well, I think what your question points to, in my mind, is really the interconnected nature of many of these crises. Like many people don't know, when you look back at the Arab Spring, that many people say was precipitated by a climate issue. And I think there
Uh-huh.
was, there was persistent drought. People couldn't, get their crops grown into market, whatever, and that precipitates something else. And if you have the climate then going haywire and precipitating mass
Right,
migrations, and those kinds of things could lead to war. I mean, there's just a if you look at this at the surface, many of these things seem like separate individual crises. But if you penetrate beneath the surface, there's often an interconnectedness, you
yeah,
see.
yeah,
I remember I was at a human rights conference some years ago, and I remember one of the human rights attorneys there on one of the panels said that she saw, whenever she kind of penetrated beneath the surface and went into a case, she said, she always found that there was a corporation in there somewhere, you know,
uh-huh, interesting,
and so there's a interconnection between the economic system and a human
yeah,
rights violation.
yeah.
So yes, so I think it doesn't take long to dig into these things and see the interconnectedness
Yeah, what
between them.
you're saying reminds me of something Michael Chossudowski pointed out in his book, The Globalization of Poverty.
Mm,
In chapter 2 of that book, he goes into World Bank, IMF
mm,
austerity programs and describes the austerity programs that these banks had imposed upon Rwanda,
yes.
which precipitated the genocidal
Mm,
crisis in Rwanda. If you say there's a corporation behind things, these banks are corporations, they're private profit making corporations.
hmm.
So we've got an interconnected a world, I guess we're both kind of honing in on this idea that we've got a world with all these multiple crises in it, and it's interconnected economically and politically in many
Yes.
ways.
Hmm.
And of course, we're both interested in world federalism and in uniting the world politically. Do you see that uniting the world politically would require, if we're going to solve these crises, would require economic transformation as well?
Well, I imagine, I mean, I guess the term economic transformation is a broad one. And that could go anywhere from, having a more progressive tax rate to a different economic system.
Right,
So I would have to say that the details of that, I mean, I'm not an economist, I'm a psychologist by
right,
original training,
right.
and have moved more into an understanding of global governance. So I'm looking more at the structures, as opposed to the economic systems per se. But I imagine at the very least, there would be a fairer, through taxation and other
Yeah.
mechanisms like that, there would be a fairer distribution of those funds. So that's about as much as I feel, standing on the knowledge base that I have, that I feel I can
Yeah.
say.
In my own thought,
Hmm.
but I became a socialist when I was 16 years old. That was quite a while ago.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I hitchhiked with a friend of mine to New York City, and we were taken by the people who hosted us there to Harlem and saw the homelessness and the poverty
Mm,
and the misery of the people there. And we engaged. They had us protesting what something called Mayor Wagner's City Hall. The mayor had this trailer posted in Harlem,
hmm.
and people were supposed to come in and talk about their problems. And of course, the narrative was that instead of doing something about their problems, he just had this kind of PR thing that where
Mm,
people could come and complain. But
Yes.
I began, of course, after that time. I was only 16, but after that time, I began to read a lot and look at a lot of economic things, Herbert Marcuse and so on.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I began to realize that integrate socialism into my own conception of world federalism, and
Yes.
socialism being maybe simply what you're talking about. We need a more equitable, a fairer, a more just. It doesn't necessarily mean no markets, but
Hmm.
we could talk about fair trade rather than free trade and those
Yes.
kind of things. Would
Yeah. No,
is
no,
that
I agree. And one, of course, one other big factor is if, I mean, right now, the US economy, more than 50% of our discretionary spending is on the military.
right?
And if you could, just imagine putting that money into meeting human needs,
Yes.
that alone would transform the country and probably by ripple effect the world. And that would even be without a change in the economic system as such. So there are so many ways at kind of economic fairness and economic justice. But again, I don't want to get beyond my skis and make comments about areas that I don't have
Well,
expertise.
I mean, I understand what you're saying, of course.
Yeah.
I'm not an economist either, I'm a philosopher. But if you read
Hmm.
my new book coming out, Designed for a Living Planet, The Earth
Yes.
Constitution Solution, it goes into the environmental economists, right? I have a
Hmm.
whole
Hmm.
chapter on the environmental economists like Herman E. Daly and Kate Raworth and Richard Heinberg. And these economists are themselves, not from a socialist point of view, so to speak,
Yes.
but from an environmental point of view, saying that capitalism, as we've known it for 3 centuries, is a disaster for the environment.
Oh, yes. Yes. I'm aware of that line of argument. Yes.
Yeah. We have to begin, my opinion, we can't just say, oh, I'm not an expert. We can't leave it to the experts because the so called experts have led us down this hellhole of environmental degradation. Right.
Yes.
And there are a whole new generation of environmental economists who are looking at things entirely differently than the traditional experts, so to speak, experts
Yes.
did, and I think that's kind of liberating for people like me, at least,
Hmm.
people who are concerned with the future of the planet, that we can grasp the fundamental issues, right? And rather than deferring to people who claim to be experts, we there's something about how we can proceed that is comprehensible. We can see what Choudowski says when he shows that the austerity measures in Rwanda
Yes.
destroyed the credibility of that society and the mutual trust among the people in that society. My question would be, how are we going to address these planetary crises unless we can fill ourselves in on the various factors and how they integrate together? Because
Yeah.
in a way, that's what world federalism is about. How do we take all these factors that are now operating in the world that seem not to be working, that lead to militarism and environmental destruction and the wealth difference between the poor and the rich? How can we deal with those factors in such a way that we create a decent planet for everybody?
Yes. Well, certainly, just to respond to what you said, um, you know, I mean, we in this country and perhaps in some of Europe have developed, what some people have called, not capitalism, but predatory capitalism or
Yeah,
vulture capitalism, and the suggestions of having more of what they would call a triple bottom line, that yes, something needs to be economically viable, but also socially viable and environmentally viable.
yeah,
And rather than just maximizing profits in the next quarter at all costs, and if not, the CEO is kicked out, they're fired.
right. Yeah,
Having a different ethic. So I think there are ways to do that. I mean, I know in a number of Scandinavian countries, for example, healthcare is run by private corporations, but they're treated as utilities. So
yeah,
there's only a minimum number or a minimum amount of profit, percentage of profit that they can generate off of it. And they're some of the most well-run systems, some of the Scandinavian
Yeah.
systems. So again, not venturing too far out of my area of expertise, from what I know about capitalism, there are ways that it could be made more healthy, and
Yeah.
there are ways that it could be made more toxic.
Right.
And unfortunately, as I understand it, we have, in this country, have specialized in the latter, in versions of capitalism that are very harmful.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so yeah, but certainly from what I've heard, I mean, if you look at countries where the people are rated as the happiest people, I recently heard, Denmark was one where the folks were, have the greatest happiness score,
Yes. Yeah.
and that is a more social democratic country, as are many of the Scandinavian nations. So
Right.
so again, I mean, I'm with you in spirit. I just don't know all the details on the economics of it.
Now, the critics of the dominant economic theories,
Hmm.
have come up with the Happy Planet Index,
Yes.
HPI, and rather than the domestic growth product
Right.
growth,
Right. Yeah.
continual growth, and the environmentalists say, in one voice, really, you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet.
Yes.
They-
Yes. Hmm.
so if capitalism, Karl Marx says that capitalism is inherently a growth issue,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
You've got your profits they're not just used for personal use. Your profits are poured back into a growth model. You
Yes.
reinvest in order to increase your wealth still further, and so on. And it would seem that one could speak. A lot of thinkers, like Michael Harrington, for example, who died young, the American thinker that was such a genius, in
Mm.
his book Socialism, Past and Future,
Hmm.
speaks of market socialism, right? So there's
Hmm.
a place for the market.
Yes.
The market has certain indicators, certain variabilities that supposedly give us efficiency in certain ways, but it can't be that everything is privatized, that everything is commodified, right? And the Happy Planet Index says, there are things that we cannot commodify, that we have to take into account in our economic thinking, right?
Yes.
Like people's sense of well-being, and their quality, their sense of the quality and meaningfulness of their life and their jobs and their participation in society, and so on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, when you talk about infinite growth, you remind me of a metaphor that I heard years ago, and I really love, that I think applies. And the metaphor is, if you wake up in the morning and you start getting dressed and put your shirt on, and if you put the first button in the wrong buttonhole, no matter how carefully, no matter how much vigilance, no matter how slowly you keep buttoning your shirt that way, things just get more and more screwed up.
That's right.
And for me, what that points at is our assumptions. So if you
Yeah.
have an assumption of infinite growth, and it's not something you necessarily think about, but it's something you think from, you
Yeah.
know, then everything that you do, buttoning each button very carefully and whatever, it's just going to be more and more disastrous. And
That's
I
right.
think when you look at the different crises, going back to your first question, that and if you kind of drill down, you see the assumptions of linear and not systemic thinking,
Right.
the lack of relationships, linear and not multiple causality. I mean, all of those things that a lot of our thinking is built on, but the assumptions are not held in awareness until there's a
Yeah.
crisis and you begin examining them.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of what we do that leads to these crises is having these underlying assumptions that ultimately, you can survive with them for a while, but ultimately, when you scale up, you see how disastrous they are.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a good point. Speaking of assumptions, and you being a psychologist, I wonder if you have ideas about a theme that has constantly come up in the past few decades, and that is so-called spirituality or spiritual moral growth, or the possibility that human beings move to a different level of consciousness. Do these things resonate with you in terms of the crisis? It could be characterized, the interrelated crises going on throughout the world could be characterized as, in some way, a false consciousness connected with these kind of false assumptions that you are mentioning, and that there might be a possibility of a kind of new human maturity or new consciousness that would let these problems solve themselves in some way.
Yeah.
That,
Well,
yeah.
I have to say your professional philosopher is definitely showing. So let me,
Oh, I'm sorry.
I would, no, we need to apologize. I was an undergraduate double major in psych and philosophy. So at least I can keep up with you.
uh,
But let me, okay, so let me respond, I guess, starting in a philosophical place, and then I'll wrap back around to what I think you're getting at. In my career as a psychologist, which was my kind of first of three careers. I went from psychologist to kind of organization development consultant, and
uh-huh,
now to doing the global work that I'm doing. So
uh-huh.
those
That's
three
great.
careers. But in my first career as a psychologist, I was very influenced by what I think popularly known as constructivist philosophy.
Yeah.
That and for your studio audience there, the what that means simply is that when we look at reality, when we look at the world, our relationships, and the world around us, we don't necessarily see things just as they are. We
Right.
see them through the interpretation of our language, our culture, even our nervous system, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how we give them meaning and then live in that world.
Right.
So we don't necessarily, in the I think the Eastern traditions, they call it the Maya, or the illusion that we live in. So given that, I believe, again, kind of staying philosophically, that the lenses we look through determine what we see. So if we look at something, at the current crises again from a more socialist lens, we'll see that the problem is capitalism.
Uh,
If we look at it through a capitalist lens, we might say the problem is you don't have open markets, or there's crony capitalism or distortions of capitalism. But true capitalism would solve all these things,
uh,
and if you look at it through a Judeo-Christian lens, you might say that these problems are because people really have fallen away from God,
right.
and are not in touch with spirit or whatever. If you look at it through a Buddhist lens, which I know a bit about, it would be greed, hatred, and delusion.
Right.
You look around, and those are the things that motivate it. So when I look at the world, since my lens is more looking at structures,
Uh-huh.
is the root cause is how the world governs itself. That's how I understand what's going on at the root of all of this. And what, if I could kind of elaborate on that, I mean, as I think all would agree, no matter what our lens is, um, that societies can't survive very long, and people certainly can't thrive in a state of lawlessness, anarchy, and chaos. That's kind of
Right.
the bottom line. So to avoid that, the founders of our country, and those that came later, devised a system with essentially four layers of government. So we have government at the city or town level, we've got it at
Right.
the county level, we've got it at the state level, and we've got it at the federal level.
Right.
And that's largely worked, except for some segments of society that we hear a lot about that we've excluded from that. But that's largely worked, at least, that our country has survived for a couple of hundred years, been relatively prosperous, et cetera, et cetera. But then what if we have one of these crises we've been talking about at the global level? We don't currently have a fifth layer of government to
Right.
handle that. So, but many would say, well, I mean, that's what the UN is for, right? And while it's true that the UN has done good in the world, that there are many, many structural deficits and problems that really prevent it from becoming the kind of global institution
Right.
that we need to handle our most pressing problems. So,
Right.
just to give you two examples that everyone is familiar with, um, that if you take the pandemic, I mean, something we're living in right now, that the World Health Organization, which is part of the UN system,
Right.
has a wonderful set of guidelines for how to prevent outbreaks from turning into pandemics.
Right.
They've got a five-step protocol, starting with anticipating problems before they happen, and then how to do early detection, communicating what you find out to the world, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, they truly have a very well thought out system. But the problem is they're only guidelines. They're not enforceable. So, China, for
Right.
example, waited about 6 days to get the news out. The US waited about 6 weeks
Right.
to admit that it had something. And for whether, political reasons or economic reasons or other reasons, many other countries also waited and sat on it, with the devastating consequences that we now see,
Right. Right.
you know. So, in another example, and then I'll swing back to the world federalist solution to these things.
Okay.
Another example, let's say, take Syria. That, okay, so we think Assad is a bad actor. He's killing his people. And, we don't have a system in the world of individual accountability.
Right.
Our laws are based on state accountability.
Right.
So all we can do if you have an Assad doing what he's doing, or, Saddam Hussein or whoever, we could arm the rebels, we could embargo the country and end up starving the children.
Right.
We don't have the kind of system that could directly address the problem.
Mm-hmm.
But if we did have a world federalist system, this fifth layer of government, if you will, then with the pandemic, let's say there was a dual reporting structure. So when that Dr. What was it, Wenliang, I believe, the Wuhan whistleblower, when he wrote his case notes, rather than them just going, filing away in the hospital or going to the province or whatever,
Right.
that they, at the same time, they get reported to a supercomputer at the World Health, the World Health Organization. There, they do like intelligence. They call it signals intelligence, where they have in the U.S. supercomputers looking at terrorist activity. They monitor phone calls overseas. They monitor the internet and look to see if there's a spike in things that point to terrorism. If then the patterns are detected by computer, then people
Yeah.
look at it, and then if there's a problem, they could respond right away. So if there was a similar thing with the pandemic, for example, with reporting these things, if patterns of unusual symptomatology or unusual diagnoses begin to pop up, there could be this dual reporting system. And then in real time, you can have experts wherever this is in the world looking at these things. And just like now, we have treaties where, if a plane crashes, an international plane anywhere in the world, there's usually a team there within 24 hours,
Yeah.
looking
Right.
at the evidence. So
Right.
you could have medical teams and labs and all that staged in different continents. And then with this dual reporting, you could have a team there within 24 hours and contain the situation, begin
Right.
developing the vaccines, if you have this global structure where you can have a global response.
Right.
The same thing with Syria. I mean, rather than having to starve the country or arm the rebels, you just arrest them,
Yeah.
and then bring them to court, and he's either found guilty or innocent.
So let me ask you this then. You said
Hmm.
you wanted to return to federalism, and what you're pointing to is a world federal structure in these
Hmm.
examples. Do you see the concept of national sovereignty as a special impediment? As you know, the scholars say that it was the end of the 30 Years' War and the Peace of
Hmm.
Westphalia in
Hmm.
1648 that first came up with a system of sovereign nation states that had governing authority over their internal affairs and
Hmm.
independence from one another in their external affairs. So here at that time, they were, of course, fighting with swords and riding
Hmm.
horses.
Hmm.
And here we are 300 years later, and we have intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons, and we have this same clinging to this notion of sovereignty.
Yes.
And in fact, if it's only, as you know, and I know, during our lifetimes, or at least my lifetime, in the
Hmm.
1960s, when so many nations in Africa became freed from being territories and became sovereign nations. And
Hmm.
this notion of the importance of sovereignty and being a sovereign nation is not at all out of the global consciousness. Everywhere I travel, I travel to Cuba, and the people there, where I've been 6 times, and the people there, say, we're a sovereign nation. What right has the U.S. got to do this to
Yeah.
us? People are taking this concept very seriously.
Hmm.
Uh, would you say that's a mistake?
Yeah, no, no, very good question. Um, Personally, I don't think sovereignty is the problem. I think absolute sovereignty is the problem.
Okay.
So that, I mean, we have a situation again in the United States, where, the states are sovereign in certain regards, and they have shared sovereignty in other regards, in terms of, national military response, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the issue is not, dissolving all of sovereignty, but again, if you add a fifth level, and again, another way, if I just kind of take another slice at it, there's another kind of perspective that say it's actually the people who are sovereign.
Yeah.
So as a sovereign individual, I give up a little bit of my sovereignty to the city. I let them set, the school regulations, the fire
Right.
regulations. So
Right.
I give up a little more sovereignty to the county, to the state. They set the speed limits and all that stuff. I mean, I don't have absolute freedom, and then I give up some sovereignty to the federal government. And what we're essentially asking individuals to do is, do they see benefit from giving up a little bit of that sovereignty to the global level?
Yeah.
So that when I go and vote for my, mayor, governor, and president, I also vote for representatives to the World Parliament. And at that level, there's a constitution, a Bill of Rights, and the other kinds of structures that are necessary to both
Yeah.
handle these, pressing problems and meet human needs.
Yeah.
So if you kind of look at sovereignty that way, that it resides in the individual, then the
That,
issue is, having individuals assign a certain amount of their sovereignty to the global level.
that's an
And if you look at it, just to finish the thought, on the national level, then it's moving from absolute sovereignty to shared sovereignty,
uh,
rather than the kind of anarchy that lives at the global level
global.
right now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's an interesting way of putting it. You sound a little bit like Gary Davis,
I
right?
knew you were going to go there.
Who insists on the sovereignty of the individuals. But there's a kind of as you may know, the Earth Constitution says the people of Earth are sovereign. All
Yes.
right. So, in Article 2, and and one of the things I've written about and thought about as a philosopher is the kind of alternative tradition to the liberal democratic tradition, an alternative democratic tradition, which is sometimes referred to as the positive freedom rather than the negative
Mm.
freedom, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So the way you put it interests me. I'm a sovereign individual. I give up a little bit of my sovereignty to the local level and the state level and so on. But those people who formulate like T.H. Green, for example, who formulate a theory of society in which the individual becomes who he or she is and is empowered precisely in terms of our cooperation and integration into
Mm. Hmm.
society itself. In other words, the whole, if it's working in a cooperative and a socially conscious way, empowers the individual to be free.
Yes.
And that's kind of a slightly, you're speaking of constructivism, of the
Hmm.
the way we look at things. That's kind of a slightly different way of looking at things than starting with the individual, who somehow, that's Lockean. Locke says,
Yes.
before the social contract, we have these natural rights and we're sovereign individuals prior to society.
Hmm. Hmm.
The positive freedom construct says, no, we're integral members of society from the very get-go,
Yes.
and what we need is a cooperative and society that allows us to have our lives empowered, precisely because that society represents the sovereignty of all of us, together.
Yeah, and to kind of throw a few more terms into the soup, that's kind of moving more from a constructivist to a social constructionist position, and from more how a psychologist would think to more of how a sociologist or anthropologist might look at this. All I can say is I agree with you that there are these multiple lenses or multiple
Yeah.
perspectives, and I think each one is valuable in that it brings certain things out that you wouldn't see otherwise, while at the same time obscuring others. So I find that it's most beneficial to have multiple lenses to move between to get
Uh-huh.
the richest picture that you can of the world around you.
Yeah, yeah. Very good. Very good. We've got a global crisis, multi-dimensional crisis. We're looking at a world governance framework that kind of that I guess you want to suggest that it is a special key for addressing all these crises in various dimensions simultaneously.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, I mean, when we look at the different problems out there and look at the solutions, they're often very compartmentalized. Environmentalists may have their thing, people working on the economy have their thing, the pandemic folks have their thing, as opposed to what kind of structure can you build that's a democratic problem solving
Yeah.
structure across the board to deal with all of these issues. So, yes, so I am an advocate for that.
Oh, right. Right. Very interesting. And of course, I am too,
You're
and
right.
the world is very complex, and bringing people around to understand how the world can move forward rapidly,
Hmm.
because the climate crisis is something that's rapidly,
Yes.
threatening us, and as well as the possibility of nuclear war and so on.
Hmm.
That's a big question, right? And that would probably take us another half an hour to discuss that question. It's something I think we both have in mind, what is our
Sure.
most effective and positive way that we can address these.
I mean, whenever I go into a new field, I like to, rather than focus on one piece of it, I like to do the survey course kind of before I do the in-depth course. So
Uh-huh.
I would suggest that your listeners, Google, World Federalist Movement, look at the different organizations that are involved, look at their strategies and tactics, and see what resonates with you. And then go there, and learn more about them, et cetera, et cetera. But really to have an appreciation of the whole kind of panoply, if you will, of
Yeah.
options and strategies and tactics. And personally, I'm an integrationist, but in my heart. So I'm always looking at how to bring the different groups together and
Yeah.
create synergies and things. So that's my hope.
Yeah.
But
I think that's
yeah, that's where I would have people
excellent.
start.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's excellent advice, I think, for the listeners. The concept of world federalism is not like an everyday term. It's not in
right,
everybody's plate. So
right.
I think it's important that it be emphasized, because it's a real, in both of our views, it's a real viable option, and
Hmm.
perhaps the most fundamental option. To our listeners, I hope you have enjoyed today's dialogue about establishing a living future for the Earth and for all future generations. Our podcast has been recorded, and the link will be streamed to multiple social media outlets and posted on my own website at oneworldrenaissance.com. I would love to hear your thoughts and reactions to this exciting conversation. You can email me at gmartin@earthconstitution.world. This podcast has been made in association with Everscope Multimedia. Thank you all so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week, and that you will join us in Creativity and Crisis at the same time and place next week. Goodbye for now, be well, and God bless.